I want to introduce part 2 of the class by looking back a little bit at what you accomplished in part 1, both in the information and examples that were presented in the course notes and the readings, as well as in the first part of the project. And of course, in that part, you identified a research problem that was grounded in some concept that I thought was important for you to consider, something related to a listing of worthwhile outcomes that I thought were important, and then kind of dissect the possibility of developing some kind of a research proposal that was designed to help you potentially solve such a problem. And I had a lot of really interesting, I thought, worthwhile learning areas, one of which had to do with anti-racism. And one of the reasons why why I included that on the list is because it has certainly been an important area of conversation for teachers and families over the last couple of years. Probably should have been something that people discussed in more detail over the last 20 years, given the problems that we are still experiencing in this country with racism and with the effects of racism. But I included that as part of the list, and for good reason. So, for example, suppose you're a teacher in high school and you are presented with the option of including some of the resources from the New York Times' Project 1619 as part of one of your social studies or history classes. Now, given what was discussed about these kinds of resources in the last Virginia gubernatorial election, you might be sort of aware that there is a belief out there or a feeling that these types of resources might lead to some level of discomfort with families and or students in your class. So let's go with that for just a moment. Suppose you were interested then as a teacher in looking at some of those resources and considering whether or not they really might make some of your students feel guilty just for being born. And I use that example only because it came up in conversation during some of the campaigning from some of the candidates for governor who were convinced that that would happen, that critical race theory or its sort of antecedents in curriculum were designed that way or had that effect, and that would be a generally accepted negative thing. Okay, so that raises an interesting question. Do those types of resources, do the experiences that teachers might design as using some of those resources, might they cause students to feel guilty just for the color of their skin, or just for being born in the situation that they were born in and not a different situation? And then, of course, is that bad? If it is true, is it bad? So to me, those are some interesting questions. And in part 1 of the class, you looked at some of the fundamentals of research and some of the fundamental research design features that sort of dissect a situation like this. And so you can look at teaching resources or curricular resources that are grounded in something like Project 1619, and you could ask yourself, or you could wonder, I wonder how it makes students in my class feel if they have this learning experience. And so just think about some of those variables for just a moment. The actual experience itself or the resources themselves could be considered a variable. Whether or not students feel maybe guilty, that's an interesting variable, something that you'd want to measure. It's something that we call a construct, because guilt, you can't point to something and say that is guilt, but you can point to lots of things and say this is how guilt is operationalized or is observed in the real world. So guilt is certainly something that could be a variable of interest. Actual knowledge of a subject area could be a variable of interest. And other negative feelings not just of guilt, but negative feelings about the class, about the resources, about the experience, about other students in the class, or positive or positive maybe feelings of empathy. That's another interesting variable. Again, something that would have to be defined operationally, and that's something that came up in part 1. So what does it mean to be empathetic? How do you measure that? How could you derive an empathy score? And how might you determine whether or not somebody actually changes their level of empathy or their level of guilt for that matter? So those are some of the important things that were addressed in part 1 of the class, and that is variables, variable types, problems, and how science is a way of trying to solve those problems. Because there are lots of ways you could solve it. You could turn on the TV and try to gain some knowledge from experts on TV, or you could read material online, or some sources, some credible, some not, or you could try to look at some type of scientific investigation or the results of a scientific investigation, and that's what part 2 of this class is. So part 2 focuses on a very important type of research design, and those are the positivist designs. Those are research designs that are grounded in a more sort of, sometimes they're referred to as sort of quantitative approaches to research. And the reason why this class emphasizes those types of designs is because they reflect what you are most likely to encounter in the next few parts of the project. And that is how are you going to design an experience that might actually help you support a hypothesis you have about the problem that you identified. So there's a lot of emphasis placed on those types of designs. Experimental designs, quasi-experimental, all of those are very specific types of designs that allow you to get at something called causality, and that is does this variable actually, is it the source of change that I've observed, or the cause of change in another variable of interest? But certainly those aren't the only types of ways to get at knowing. For example, part 3 of the class, which follows this part, addresses some research designs that are not what we call positivist in nature, but certainly they have the potential to provide as much insight, if not more, as positivist designs. So, for example, let me just give you a for example. Let's say that you wanted to study whether or not students felt guilt for their race, for being born into their race because of some lesson experiences that you designed and implemented that were related to some of the Project 16 material. Let's just say that that was your that was what you were interested in studying. Now, from a scientific perspective, or I can't even say scientific, because many of these models, whether they're positivist or interpretivist, they all reflect science, honestly. But let's say that in a positivist design, your approach was simply, well, I'm going to implement this particular set of resources for a group of students, and I'm going to then measure their level of guilt for being born into their class or being born as a member of the race that they're born as. Now, you'd probably want to measure the state of guilt before the experience and after the experience, and that might be part of your design. So that would definitely be a positivist design, and it would certainly require you to figure out, well, how are you going to measure a state of feeling guilty, and whether or not that state is negative or positive. Now, for the next part of this class, for part 2, you're going to look at in the project, if that was if that was one of the variables you were interested in, you'd want to look at, well, how do other people measure levels of guilt for students or people who might be within your population or the sample that you're going to be looking at. So that's the fun part of part two, is you get to say to yourself, well, how have other people investigated this? And how might I or my design be informed by what other people have already done? Certainly valuable when it comes to defining variables, operationalizing them, and then deciding how you're going to measure such variables. So that's very important. But as I mentioned, it's not the only approach that you can take. So in part three of the class, you're going to look at designs that might be very different. For example, one design might be that you as an observer would go into a class where somebody is teaching some history experience that includes some of the materials from Project 1619. And you might just observe the class, and you might observe the reactions that students are having as they go through the experience. And some of those students, sort of regardless of who they might be in terms of their race or socioeconomic background, they might be presenting reactions that seem either positive or negative to you. And then you as a researcher might go up and just, without any pretense, without any preconceived notion, you might start asking them questions about how the experience is being realized by them, and what are their experiences, and why do they appear to be reacting in certain ways. And as you sort of record that information and pursue ideas with follow-up questions, you might end up writing a story that's not based on the data from a classroom of students or based on the data of a whole subpopulation of students in a school district or even in our country, but you might end up with a story from one person in the classroom who had some type of effect because of the experience. And that story itself might actually be as valuable to the world, and even as valuable to you as a researcher, as a much more carefully designed, sort of causally oriented research focus. And that doesn't mean that the results you're going to get are going to be able to be generalized to the entire population. But again, the results might end up being a story that is worth 1,000 subjects, you know? Like a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so that is just as valid of a research approach. It may not hold up in terms of a level of scientific integrity that would allow you to take those results and say with a high degree of confidence that this is how all people in this situation react, feel, and respond to those situations. But it doesn't mean it doesn't have tremendous value. And so that's what sort of part three is. But in part two, now you're going to focus on the kinds of research designs that really do sort of inherently allow you to try and draw some solid conclusions about cause and effect. And so that's why it's such an important thing to focus on, and why we have a whole part on it. So hope you enjoy it. Your part ones will be evaluated. You'll get some good feedback over that, and then you'll be able to dive into part two and do the kind of background research you'll need to help really begin to better understand the variables that you're interested in studying more closely. So I hope you're enjoying this process.